In this video, I'm going to examine a recently released document which provides a useful insight into the police investigation of the Council of Chester Hospital. I'm being generous to describe it as an investigation of the Council of Chester Hospital because the police very evidently never investigated the hospital and only investigated Lucy Letby in order to prove a hypothesis that they'd already decided was correct from the beginning. However, this document has numerous leaked documents from the police investigation, and the reason that I'm dealing with it now, I've had this in my possession for a while, and it's also been available online, is that the Sun newspaper has written this article on the 17th of January, bombshell 150-page dossier of never before seen Lucy Letby docs could prove killer nurse is actually innocent. So I thought it would be a good time to assess this document. And it begins, Dr. Evans is going to feature prominently in this section that we're going to assess, which is related to Operation Hummingbird. So we have here Dr. Evans on the 21st of May sending this infamous email to his contact at the National Crime Agency, where he says, incidentally, I've read about the high rate of babies in Chester and that the police are investigating. Do they have a paediatric neonatal contact? Of course, as in common with everything, even when we've got it in black and white, he later has gone on to deny that he actively contacted the National Crime Agency and actively inserted himself into the process. Whether or not this should have been allowed is debatable, but the fact is it has been allowed, so that's the world we're living in. One sentence that is cited here by the author of this document, and that I also cited in my book, is this final one, where he says, I understand that the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health has been involved, but from my experience, the police are far better at investigating this sort of problem. Now, the author says it is instructive that Dr. Evans in this first email rubbishes the RCPCH and by implication, its findings in relation to poor care, etc. So what I would add to that is that it really makes no sense for a paediatrician to dismiss the capabilities of the Royal College to investigate a medical situation and instead to say, oh, the police can actually do a better job. I mean, on what basis could you possibly make that assertion? Dr. Evans is proud of the fact that he's a paediatrician. He still signs things as a consultant paediatrician, even though he hasn't worked in a hospital now for nearly 20 years. And he has every right to be proud of being a paediatrician, but it seems extraordinary that he would bash a major body of paediatrics in this way and say that the completely unqualified police are better at investigating this sort of problem. And I've just, I think anyone can make this conclusion anyway, but I've just asked a question here. I've written down the statement and said, can there be any reasonable justification for this assertion that the police will be better at investigating a medical matter than the RCPCH? Is this a strange comment considering it originates from a retired paediatrician? And of course, the language model says, yes, it's a very strange assertion and there is only a narrow conditional sense in which it could be justified. So we'll go on to examine that in a second. But not unreasonably, it's pointed out, the RCPCH is actually for assessing patterns of morbidity and mortality, reviewing clinical practices, evaluating diagnostic reasoning, etc. Whereas the police are trying to investigate criminal acts, gather evidence after a crime is suspected, interview witnesses, etc., etc. They are not trained to assess neonatal physiology, distinguish rare but natural clinical deterioration from wrongdoing, evaluate whether a diagnosis is plausible, or critically appraise medical expert opinion. Indeed, they're also not trained to run a medical investigation. And we know that we've had Dr. Steve Watts on, we know that they didn't even follow the basic protocol. Is there any reasonable interpretation where the statement could make sense? There is one limited interpretation where the statement might be charitably defended. If and only if there is already good medical consensus that crimes have occurred, then police are better placed to investigate who committed them. So obviously we know that's not the case. In fact, at this stage, the police say there is no evidence other than coincidence for malfeasance. Why this comment is especially troubling coming from a retired paediatrician. It is particularly odd given the speaker's background. A paediatrician should know that neonatal medicine is highly complex, outcomes can cluster by chance, staffing or systemic stress, retrospective pattern matching is notoriously unreliable, non-specialists routinely misinterpret neonatal data. So I'll just go down to the bottom line briefly. Yes, the comment is highly unusual and conceptually flawed. No, police are not better equipped than the RCPCH to investigate whether a spike in neonatal deaths has a medical explanation. Only after medical experts establish non-natural causes does police expertise become relevant. Coming from a retired paediatrician, the remark is especially surprising and raises serious questions about reasoning, role confusion, or hindsight bias. So the author here points out that in the infamous Operation Hummingbird promotional film, Paul Hughes states that the Cheshire Police sought advice from the National Crime Agency about how we go ahead and we appoint the relevant expert, the best expert we can have. So I think it's generous here of the author to describe this as disingenuous. I mean, it just seems to be plainly untrue to say that Cheshire Police sought advice from the NCA about getting a relevant expert, when it was the NCA who contacted Cheshire Police and presented Evans to them, there's no evidence that they ever did anything else other than this, indeed. And of course, the author rightly points out that Evans was as far from the best expert we can have as it was possible to be. So I've also interviewed Paul Hughes. I've not interviewed Paul Hughes. I've also examined this interview of Paul Hughes by Liz Hull, in which he made numerous other rather extraordinary statements. So you may wish to have a look at that at some point if you haven't already. So then Sonia Bayliss, I forget what her exact rank is at Cheshire Police, but she's involved in communication with Dr. Evans and seems to have a role that is broadly related to that. So she writes here, a potential nominal has been highlighted who is a nurse at the hospital who was on duty when all the babies died, and that Cheshire Police's request is for a number of expert medical opinions in a number of key areas, providing opinions on whether the babies who died or collapsed had pre-existing issues to cause their conditions, or neglect was involved due to processes, staffing levels, and working practices in place within the hospital, or whether there was third-party intervention. So it's important to note that in previous discussions we've had on this channel, I've noted that the letter written by the Council Chester Hospital requested the police to exclude unnatural causes. And Dr. Stephen Breary, to his credit, I won't say many positive things about Dr. Stephen Breary, but he did say there needs to be a multidisciplinary review of the cases and of the situation at the hospital. And I wondered if Cheshire Police had understood this, but we know now, Sonia Bayliss is saying here, we need a number of expert medical opinions in a number of key areas. Obviously, it can be considered a little worrying and a little prone to confirmation bias that they are talking about a potential nominal being highlighted when the investigation should be as dispassionate as possible. But as we'll see, this notion of a number of expert medical opinions in a number of key areas is just allowed to drift away. So Bayliss then offers assistance with respect to various things, but what I particularly wanted to highlight here was that she mentioned the potential exhumations of 5 of the buried babies. Now, I don't know how often that would happen. I don't know if that is even plausible. I don't know if it's useful at this point in time. Obviously, it would be very difficult for the parents. It may have been concluded that this is just impossible. I'm not really medically qualified to know whether or not. I mean, I do know enough. I do know enough to say that some of the conditions that Dr. Evans. I mean, obviously, if you dig up the babies at this point, there's not going to be any physical evidence of air embolism because it will disappear very, very quickly. So in that sense, that would have destroyed his theories. We could have still used them. They could have just excluded this process. But I thought it was really interesting that they were talking about exhuming the buried babies. I would be interested to get some informed view on this. I haven't asked Stephanie Davies about it, but maybe I'll remember to do that in the future. But I'm sure there are circumstances where this happens, but obviously with them being babies, it would be particularly sensitive. Anyway, this clearly never happened. So then Bayliss goes on to speak about the suspect, the so-called suspect. She's not supposed to be a suspect at this point. Once the nominal has been interviewed or provided a prepared statement, a copy of this will be required by the medical experts. So I suppose my reflection to that would be, why are you talking about interviewing Lucy at this stage? You don't know that she's a suspect. You don't know that you will ever interview her. So maybe it's somewhat justified to be prepared for that, but it seems to me putting the cart rather ahead of the horse at this point. And then I'm not going to read out all of this. They're talking about instruct. You can see already they're going to instruct Dewi Evans. So there's been no effort to find the best expert, as they claimed in the Hummingbird video. They never made any effort. They just allowed Dr. Evans to walk in there and let him run the whole investigation, as we'll see as this video unfolds. It may take more than one video. It likely will take more than one video to go through all of this. But over the series as a whole, you will see what happened. But it's notable here that they're already saying Dr. Evans would be willing to assist with the interview process. So they're already not, let's be generous and say not decided, but let's just say floating the idea that they will interview Lucy Letby, and that Dr. Evans, who will be basically told that she's a suspect, will assist with the interviewing of Lucy Letby. I mean, this is so far away from a process that you would expect to see or want to see. And then also, remember, Dr. Evans is always saying, oh, I had no idea that Lucy Letby was involved. Now, obviously, I've highlighted the fact that we know for a fact he wrote approximately 25 reports when he definitely knew the name of Lucy Letby. We don't know for absolute certain that he knew the identity of Lucy Letby when he began, but we're going to see in this series that it's extremely likely that he did. So, moving on to the next document, there's more comments from Sonia Bayliss. She suggests that Cheshire Police should have Dr. Evans help them with respect to instructing the following experts. This is a very critical aspect of this whole document. She suggests that there should be forensic and neonatal pathologists to review jointly the medical histories, etc. So there's a comment from the author that Cheshire Police engaged just one pathologist, Dr. Monarides, and it's not clear that he was either forensic or neonatal. I should say as well that he didn't jointly review the medical histories. Cheshire Police arrested Lucy Letby when they had only seen the work of Dr. Dewi Evans. And Paul Hughes indicated in the interview that I've already highlighted that he'd basically decided that Lucy Letby was guilty by that point anyway. And you can see already they're naming her as a suspect, even before they've met Dr. Evans or have done any investigation whatsoever. They're always saying, oh, how shall we interview her? Maybe Dr. Evans could help with the interview. I mean, it's obviously deeply inappropriate, is the most generous statement you can make. They then move on to talk about a forensic toxicologist and or clinical pharmacologist to review the test results for all sampling conducted on the babies, etc. Forensic toxicologist, neither a forensic toxicologist nor a clinical pharmacologist was instructed. One may ask why. Did Cheshire Police find it difficult to identify a forensic toxicologist expert who would not have said that the insulin immunoassay should be used for forensic purposes? This may explain why it was Anna Milan who testified at trial as a witness of fact rather than an expert witness, saying that the only explanation for high insulin, low C-peptide was exogenous insulin. Of course, this is a little speculative. We simply don't know, but it's a very good question. I think another interpretation is that they just never made any attempt to identify a forensic toxicologist whatsoever. It seems that very little effort was made to identify any of these experts, and certainly none were instructed. So we can, I think, not unreasonably assume that Cheshire Police just didn't try to find one. After all, they didn't try to find anyone else other than Dr. Evans. And then they were also asked to involve a nurse with experience of working in a special baby unit for neonatal births, etc. The nurse expert who was instructed was an adult nurse. It surely wouldn't have been that difficult for them to find a neonatal nurse. Surely. I mean, there really is no excuse for that, but yeah, they didn't actually manage to find or even seemingly attempt to find a neonatal nurse. I probably let me just add as well that certainly the consensus of nurses that I've spoken with is that the voices of nurses were absolutely wiped out of the court case. A medical expert with experience of the working practices involved in a special baby unit for neonatal births, etc. None was instructed. I seem to have duplicated that. I do apologise. An obstetrician to review the medical histories, test results, hospital notes, reports, scans, medication, etc. As we know, no obstetrician was instructed. In fact, they never seemingly looked at the obstetric notes, and we're going to learn more about the maternity notes as this video continues. All I really say is that Dr. Evans wasn't too keen on seeing the maternity notes. And then there's more comments here from Bayliss that discussing with a medical expert or leading the CDOP process whether there were any failings by the local CDOP team with regards to not flagging early the peak in mortality numbers at the hospital, including reviewing both reports provided by an independent paediatrician instructed by the hospital and the RCPCH. And so it goes on, conducting a scope search of the National Injuries Database for similar cases. Needless to say, they didn't do either of these things. They didn't accept either offer. So then on the 28th of June, Moore writes to the NID, this National Injuries Database. It's part of the National Crime Agency. Sonia has recommended... Also, I've forgotten the Christian name of this person, Moore. It's not particularly important. Sonia has recommended various experts. We were hoping to meet with Dr. Dewi Evans in advance of deciding on the other experts. Is this possible, and should we go through yourselves to organise this? I can attach a summary of the inquiry so far if he is agreeable. Now, they're still talking in fairly reasonable language at this point. They're hoping to meet with Dr. Evans, right? So they should meet with him, and they should still consider other experts for that role. They obviously don't. The next thing is they're talking about in advance of deciding on the other experts. Somehow, they allow Dr. Evans to just shift that to one side and it just melts away and then it never happens. It's unbelievable that this occurred. I always suspected this was the case. I always suspected that what had happened, and the reason they hadn't obviously done a multidisciplinary review, was that Dr. Evans had bamboozled them and blinded them with science, and the police are obviously not experienced. I didn't realise they'd had a steer from the National Crime Agency. I knew that Dr. Brewery, as I'll highlight in a second, I knew Dr. Brewery had told them there should be a multidisciplinary review. I didn't realise the National Crime Agency had told them there should be a multidisciplinary review. So obviously they should have paid heed to this. I initially suspected that Dr. Evans had told them, oh, you don't need other experts, just leave everything to me. Of course, I was absolutely right about that, as I've been correct about basically everything that I've assumed and surmised about the police investigation, because I could see all the patterns from the video that they released that's supposed to make them look good. So I suspected Dr. Evans had done this. What I didn't know was that they'd actually received very explicit advice from an organisation that they communicate with all the time that they should definitely have been paying attention to. So as mentioned, this is the comment from Dr. Stephen Brewery. The case notes review by Dr. Horden did assess some cases. This was not what the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health review asked for. What happened was one neonatologist looked at case notes. This was not the multidiscipline review that was suggested. So it's really heavily emphasised here in notes by Nigel Wenham. They point out, and they knew, they had the information, they had this from the National Crime Agency. Dr. Stephen Brewery had told them this. They've put it in capitals here that one person has looked at the case notes. It's not a multidiscipline review. And then from here, they managed to make a complete and utter pig's ear of the investigation. So then Sonia Bayliss writes back, Dear Janet, so I think this is the Moore person that I refer to, Janet Moore. In relation to your email below and confirmation of one of our services, i.e. instruction of Dr. Dewi Evans, I will now formalise his services and email him, as well as try and call him, though I have left several messages, including to Paul. If only he hadn't got back to them. Once I have made contact, I will get his availability to meet and discuss the case further with yourselves and what his costings will be. In the meantime, a copy of the current situation report would be useful, please, and confirmation that a copy of the case summary can be provided to Dr. Evans. And then we have a further letter from the police to Dr. Evans, despite the fact that, they're looking for the best person for the job, supposedly. Dear Dr. Evans, I'm supporting an investigation on behalf of Cheshire Police in relation to a number of neonatal deaths in a special baby unit within a hospital and significant collapses between June 2015 and June 2016. You kindly approached one of my team, Nick Casey, to offer your services, which I'm grateful for, and since offered this to the investigation team. The force have now confirmed your services are required and would like a meeting soon to discuss the case further and the current situation, as well as your costings for your services, as this will be a lengthy process involving reviewing the working practices and processes in the unit, the initial complaint by a group of paediatricians within the hospital, and the subsequent reviews, as well as the actual conditions of the babies. Now, it's debatable, highly debatable, I would say, whether she should have been telling Dr. Evans that there had been an initial complaint by a group of paediatricians within the hospital. It seems to me that he should have just been given the medical notes and asked to look at the medical notes. Dr. Evans always made this claim, oh, I had no idea that a crime had been committed, but actually you've just been told that paediatricians have made a complaint. So obviously the paediatricians haven't made a complaint against themselves, have they? They haven't gone to the police and said, oh, we've made a load of mistakes. Why don't you highlight all of our medical errors? They've obviously come to the police suspecting some sort of criminal activity. So again, yet another statement by Dr. Evans, I had no idea that a crime had been taken place. Obviously that was ridiculous anyway, because he's driving to Cheshire Police Station, having spoken to the National Crime Agency, and he's in the police station talking to the police. Of course he thinks a crime has been committed, but we now know not only... I mean, you'd have to be a monumental idiot not to suspect that a crime had been committed, but we know that he knew damn well that there were suspicions because the police told him. So anyway, this continues. In the meantime, I have suggested that they need to collate all the relevant paperwork, including medical histories of all the babies, interviews of the staff involved, medical reports produced, tests conducted and medication given, etc. But further guidance from yourself with regards to all the essential material that is required would be useful. So this shouldn't be happening, again, in my opinion. They should simply be saying to him, there are certain circumstances related to the accounts of Chester Hospital. We'd like to speak with you. What dates are you available? They don't need to. They don't need to, and they shouldn't tell him anything else other than that. They're already asking him, what sort of stuff do you think we should get? What these paediatricians have been making. They shouldn't be saying any of these stuff. It's not for Dr. Evans to say anything because you haven't even decided whether an investigation is justified at this point. Dr. Evans, if he was a dispassionate person, there are obviously serious question marks about whether he is dispassionate. He could have just walked in, he has to look at the notes. He could say, oh, well, there's very clear medical reasons why this occurred. I don't see any reason for any further investigation. That would be rash and that would be hasty, but that was possible. In which case, all of this stuff is irrelevant. They should not have been saying that. And also, as we've mentioned several times previously already, they're supposed to be finding the best person for the job. Basically, this should be like a job interview. They should be meeting with Dr. Evans, having a bit of conversation with him, seeing what he has to say, and then saying, all right, okay, well, thank you for your time. We're now going to speak to several other paediatricians and possibly even some neonatologists. Instead, they're already saying, oh, we could involve Dr. Evans in the interviewing. Oh, here you go, Dr. Evans. Here's some kind of confidential details about the investigation. Or why don't you tell us what materials are needed? They've already decided they're going to involve him before they've even met him, despite what they've said elsewhere. Please can you this is all they should have said. Please can you let me know your availability to meet with the senior officer in the case and myself as facilitator at a location suitable to you and whether any costs will be involved for this initial meeting. Look forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, I have left several messages, but to date have not received a response from yourself. So basically, this is all that was required from this letter was, Dear Dr. Evans, I'm supporting an investigation on behalf of Cheshire Police in relation to a number of neonatal deaths in a special baby unit within the hospital. And then the last paragraph, please can you let me know your availability? Everything between then is not needed, and it shouldn't have been communicated. So then Dr. Evans sets off on his journey from Carmarthen to Blacon in Chester. As I've demonstrated before, that's a 7-hour round trip. And I would suggest to you that it was extremely unlikely that he was going to make this trip, having waived all expenses and all payment for this trip, and then conclude that, oh, everything is absolutely fine. I don't need to be engaged in this process. You don't need to employ me. You don't need to pay me any money. I would suggest to you that's a very long trip to take. Personally, for me, I've done a few long trips as a writer. I remember doing one to Edinburgh at one point. Now, I would not have done that without some kind of pre-journey assurances that I was going to get paid. Now, Dr. Evans may be in a superior financial position to myself, but I still don't think he's going to do a 7-hour round trip on the off chance that there's some work at the end of it for him. I think that there were certain assumptions made before that journey began. So there's a couple of comments here from the author. There is no evidence that there was any serious consideration of whether Evans was the right neonatal paediatrician, which I of course agree with. The only one of these, reviewing the working practices and process in the unit, the initial complaint by a group of paediatricians, etc., that Evans did was the last, i.e. condition of the babies, etc. So authors essentially saying he didn't do any of these things. I still believe that they just should not have been communicated to him at this time for reason one, apart from anything else, that they shouldn't even have decided that he's being involved in the case at this point. So then Sonia Bayliss sends another email. Dear all, I have since emailed Dr. Evans, having had confirmation from Janet Moore that his services are required, and asked for all his costings for each phase, as well as availability for a meeting amongst ourselves. So this is an email broadly to Cheshire Police. Also, can you confirm who the original pathologists were, please, as I seemed to have included Dr. Hunt in my assessment, who I believe was not involved. My apologies. So as far as we know, that's correct. And then Janet Moore writes back to Sonia Bayliss and says, Hello Sonia, I attach a summary of Operation Hummingbird, if you can please pass on to Dr. Evans. Many thanks, Janet. I apologise for laughing because this really isn't funny. But it's hard to see how they could have done things in a worse way or a more incompetent fashion. Of course, the author rightly says there was information in the summary document that Dr. Evans should not have been given. So his claim that I just mentioned previously that, I had no idea that a crime had been committed, it becoming less and less credible by the second, you'd have to say. So we then move on to an extract from the document that has just been shared by Dr. Evans before he's even met the police. This is still in June. He meets with the police in July. Concerns were raised by the clinical team of the hospital, the executives, regarding a higher than usual number of neonatal deaths. But I've highlighted the key comment in this report. It was highlighted at this meeting that there was one member of the nursing staff who had been present at more of the cases than any other member of staff. So, as the author says here, Dr. Evans was sent this report, so he was alerted to the fact that a nurse was under suspicion. Should he therefore have been sent the report, might this explain why he never considered other explanations for the deaths and collapses as he was requested to do? I think the answers to those questions, I think there's a pretty much rhetorical questions. I think the answers are quite obvious. So move on to the next document. So in this, this is another aspect of the report. There's a note here about a comprehensive review of the unit to include activity, acuity, and staffing levels. By the way, I'm not going to read through every single word in this document, and indeed I've missed out a few little bits and pieces because it would take an enormously long time. It's going to take quite some time anyway. But I just want to highlight here this comprehensive review of the unit. And the comment here is regarding the comprehensive review of the unit to include activity, acuity, and staffing levels. This was authored by Dr. Brewery, who concluded that the elevated mortality and morbidity had nothing to do with acuity, activity, and staffing. As one of Letby's main accusers, him conducting the review represented a significant conflict of interest. Indeed, his finding that the elevated mortality and morbidity had nothing to do with acuity, activity, and staffing was simply not true. It had everything to do with them. There's nothing that I can add to that. I've spoken many times about the involvement of Dr. Brewery as an accuser, as an investigator, and then in the court case. It's staggering, it's incredible, it should never have been allowed to happen. There isn't much else I can say other than that, but we're learning even more about the police investigation now and how incompetent it was, which, if anyone has seen the promotional film they made on Operation Hummingbird, I don't think that would come as an enormous surprise. So then on the 3rd of July, we're still waiting at this point for Cheshire Police to actually meet Dr. Evans. So all this is happening before Dr. Evans actually meets them even. Hi Sonia, I am another one of the Cheshire MIT DSs working on this inquiry. I know DS Janet Moore has already updated you with a list of pathologists. Has Dr. Dewi Evans come back to you as yet with his costings and availability? We could do with speaking with him sooner rather than later, even if we can just get a telephone appointment with him initially. Cheers, Adam. So it seems to me, this is what I would infer from this, is that their main consideration with regard to Dr. Evans is how much does he cost and is he available? And once they decided, the costings are okay and he's available, they just went with him. I don't think there was any further consideration other than that, and they certainly never spoke to anyone else or engaged anyone else, despite the fact that they've told us completely different previously. So there's then another email here where they're just this is Sonia or Janet emailing back to Adam. And then they confirm some stuff, some kind of trivial stuff about Dr. Evans, and then confirm that he has been given a copy of the current situation report provided by Janet. So he's already been told that there's a police investigation and a criminal investigation before he sets off on his 7-hour round trip. So claims that he didn't know, I had no idea what was going on. We know for a fact that that's completely untrue. I just need to zoom in on this one a little bit. So here, later in this communication, I want to highlight this comment. During this meeting, we will also discuss additional experts that may be required, which can be facilitated by the NID team. Just a reminder, that's part of the National Crime Agency, using either our experts or those suggested by Dr. Evans that require checking before instruction. So it's getting further and further away now. This is supposed to be, let's try and find the best expert. Let's see if Dr. Evans is suitable. They're already saying, right, he could interview Lucy Letby. Let's give him this report. Let's tell him the paediatricians have suspicions. Let's get him to suggest other experts. What kind of process is this? It's laughable. So they continue, requiring checking before instruction, including an infectious diseases expert, obstetrician and forensic paediatric pathologist, already suggested by myself, and will come with names from the NID list to the meeting. So, as I mentioned earlier, I suspected that Cheshire Police became really confused by Dr. Evans, and they just couldn't grasp the fact that they needed to have a multidisciplinary review with multiple experts. In fact, they were advised this several times by several different people, by credible sources. You know, it's reasonable to describe Dr. Brewery as a credible source, even though he's also unreliable in some respects. But one of the fair things that he did say was that there should be a multidisciplinary review. We're now days away from the meeting with Dr. Evans. They still know that they should have other experts that are involved in the investigation, and it is then extraordinary what they allow to happen from this point. So then I've just highlighted this bit where Dr. Evans has agreed for his preliminary meeting to be free, apart from his travel expenses, which the police are willing to pay. I don't think Dr. Evans intended to come out with the entire investigation having not been paid. Let's just say that. There was an interesting comment here as well from the author of this document, noting that Dr. Evans received Child O's case notes at the meeting, and he says, should this have happened had he not been instructed? Of course, he hasn't been instructed. I think this is a very interesting technical point. I think also, broadly speaking, it seems clear to me that they never should have handed over any case notes at the first meeting anyway. It should have been a preliminary meeting between them to discuss the outline of what was going to occur, and indeed they should have been holding several meetings with other people, doing the same thing at each meeting, not handing out the case notes and going, oh, do you reckon there's been any deliberate harm? Oh, yes, actually I do. Let me just take all the case notes away. Clearly this should never have happened. Just yet another example of unprofessional conduct. Again, there's another emphasis here that other additional experts can be facilitated by the NID team using either our experts or those suggested by yourself. Now, all of the evidence at this point is pointing to Dr. Evans having suggested the experts, not least because he says, oh, don't bring any experts in at this point because they might disagree with me. Bring the experts in that I suggest later after I've written my reports, and then I can prompt them on what they need to say, which is literally in the Court of Appeal document exactly what it says that he's done with Dr. Bohin. All Dr. Bohin got was Dr. Evans' reports, Dr. Evans' conclusions. Oh, what a surprise, I agree with them all. And then I've highlighted this bit as well, where the police say to Dr. Evans, you have worked in this environment before and would know which specialists and staff were involved, tests undertaken and medication given, as well as notes and assessments performed. That's ironic, considering Dr. Evans doesn't want to know anything about the environment. He actively avoided learning anything about the environment, let alone any tests that were undertaken, medication, anything like that. You'll see that he just hand waves this all away. And he never examines any of this, any context. The only thing he does is tries to find methods of malfeasance, as we'll see as this video and this series continues. So then I've highlighted this is a response from Dr. Evans. And so immediately, as I've just mentioned, he states possibly the only way to look at the issues is to start from scratch. So it's good of him to say possibly, because that's not true at all. It's not true that the only way to look at this was to start from scratch and discard, as he says here. I mean, no disrespect to previous reviews. It's just better if we discard them. One needs to avoid groupthink. So all this information that's asked for here, you need to know, you know about the environment, you know about specialists, you know about staff, tests, medication, etc. All very valid points actually by the police. I mean, this is an example of them making a valid statement, and Dr. Evans says, it's just better if we just throw all that away and I just look at the case notes from scratch to avoid quote-unquote groupthink. I think we know what he was trying to avoid, but I'll leave other people to conclude what that might be. And then this same statement from Dr. Evans goes on to say, before looking for suspicious matters, why are you looking for suspicious? You shouldn't be looking for suspicious matters. You should be analysing the notes dispassionately. You shouldn't be looking for suspicious matters. I mean, that's like a Freudian slip, if ever I've encountered one. Then he goes on to say the following. One needs to see if the clinical trends in the hours and days prior to death followed a recognised clinical pattern. I suspect not, which is why the paediatricians have flagged it up. So there's a few things to mention here. Firstly, he's already made his mind up before he even looks at the notes. He probably didn't, so, probably it's suspicious. He's already decided before he even looked at anything. Not just in 10 minutes. He just decided, he's already made his mind up. I'm going to drive down there. I will decide it's suspicious. This is very clear. Secondly, this comment about, the paediatricians must have flagged it up for some reason. It's just a kind of inbuilt prejudice that you'll see among clinicians generally. And I'd love to have any doctors in particular, but any medical professionals that have an opinion on this. I would love to read your comments. But it seems to me that Dr. Evans is someone who will always go with his beloved paediatricians. The paediatricians are always right. The doctors are always right. That's why you see him, for example, backing Sir Roy Meadow. He signed this letter infamously, and he's done numerous other things. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I think this is kind of illustrative or emblematic of a kind of cultural attitude that he has. So although all the things we've mentioned previously, we've mentioned all the reasons why Dr. Evans has done what he's done. We're all aware of those reasons. But I think an additional one is just a kind of cultural prejudice and an unwillingness to go against the paediatrician. So he has just assumed, right, the paediatricians must have flagged this up. The paediatricians must be right because they're doctors and they're always right. Therefore, I'm not going to say anything to go against that. I'm just going to assume that the paediatricians are correct. I don't think that's the primary reason, but I think that's a contributing factor to why he so quickly assumed malfeasance. Of course, I don't believe that's the main reason. And then he makes this comment, premature babies, even tiny premature babies, tend not to just die. They may stop breathing, but this is well known. It's picked up by monitors and usually remedied. So again, it's a very flippant comment, but it's indicative again of the fact that he's already made up his mind, essentially. And then he goes further still by saying, also one can identify evidence of infection, which is common, and hemorrhage via the usual tests, all easily available in baby units and for the past couple of decades. So, again, he's just assuming that all this has been done. He's assuming, they would have known about infection, so I don't need to know about that. So he hand waves all these things, as we'll see later on. He says, obviously if there's any problems, they would have picked this up via tests. And he doesn't make any effort to examine the hospital, and he doesn't make any effort to examine the doctors. Now, that is either due to extreme prejudice and lack of professionalism on his behalf, or it's due to the fact that he knew that if he identified things, there might not be a legitimate investigation into the hospital from a criminal perspective, or it's due to both of these things. I can't really say what the contributing factors are. I can only surmise, but I'm sure that people will have their own opinions on this. So the next thing Dr. Evans says here that I've highlighted is that one needs to apply a different logistical approach, I suspect, given the numbers of cases involved and the common factor, same hospital. So already, he's decided I'm going to start looking for common factors. So he mentions the fact that there's a common factor with it being the same hospital. Now, this is essentially complete drivel, because of course the cases are going to come from the same hospital. It's an investigation of the County Chester. The police aren't going to be looking at, eventually there were 17 cases in the court case. So they're not going to be looking at 17 cases from 17 different hospitals, because then there wouldn't be a spike in deaths. So obviously they're going to be from the same hospital. That's a statement of the bleeding obvious. And this is just indicative of the incredibly biased outlook that Dr. Heavens had before he hasn't even met them yet. He hasn't even been into the police station. He hasn't even made his infamous 10-minute decision. He's already decided before he gets there, as I've suggested previously. And then he makes this kind of comment about parking himself in Chester for a few days, trawling through the notes, putting it all on tape and moving on to the next case. So it means basically anything other than in investigating the contextual situation of the hospital and speaking to anyone else and letting anyone else look at the notes. So the author of this document has raised several points that I'm going to go over. The first one is regarding this comment: before looking for suspicious matters, one needs to see if the clinical trends in the hours and days prior to death followed a recognised clinical pattern. I suspect not, which is why the paediatricians have flagged it up. This is clear and early evidence that Evans was not keeping an open mind. If he had been, he would not have included the second sentence, which very much consistent with my opinion. Second point is, premature babies, even tiny premature babies, tend not to just die. Again, why is this necessary before seeing the notes? Again, this would be exactly my outlook. I mean, he's essentially already decided this is suspicious before he even gets into his car. And then thirdly, also one can identify evidence of infection, which is common, and hemorrhage via the usual tests, all easily available in baby units in 2015 and for the past couple of decades. So here, the author says Dr. Evans appears to be saying that because infection can be easily identified, there is no need for an infectious diseases expert, which we will see he hand waves. But I think also he's just saying, I don't need to look for infection at all, because they would have found the infection on the unit. So if they didn't find the infection, that means we can rule it out. That's basically the implication of what he's saying. So the fourth comment is, one needs to apply a different logistical approach, I suspect, given the number of cases involved in the common factor. Why does Evans feel the need to make it explicit that the common factor is the hospital? Is it because he already knows that the common factor that Cheshire Police are looking at is in fact a nurse, but has to pretend he doesn't know about that? So that's an interesting observation. I think we know, given what's been handed over to him, that he does know the common factor is a nurse. And this is an interesting interpretation of those words. And then he makes a comment about park myself in Chester and trawl through the notes are thoroughly unprofessional, inappropriate. I don't know if I can really comment on that. I just find it, I mean, he described it, the author described elsewhere Dr. Evans' like chumminess with the police as nauseating, which I think is an excellent description. Even when he's trying to be nice, he's so insincere and so cringy. It's just sickening, really. But I mean, I don't have a high opinion of him. I think that's quite clear by now. I try to be as objective as I can. It's very difficult to be neutral about such a dangerous, unpleasant character who is just so arrogant and so inappropriate in things that he does. And then the sixth point relates to this comment Evans makes. Finally, I hope that I can assure you that I'm not under any kind of investigation as a result of my clinical or legal practice, and managed 30 years in consultant paediatric practice without having my clinical skills queried by the GMC or any other body. So I didn't highlight this, but the author says he is careful not to divulge whether his testimony in previous trials had been questioned by presiding judges. It had been. Why did Cheshire Police not ask? So Dr. Evans has claimed that he didn't know about the very stinging criticism from Lord Justice Jackson. Now, I think we can take anything that he says with a shovelful of salt by this point, but we don't know for certain that he did know about it. However, Cheshire Police should certainly do their due diligence. They do the opposite of due diligence, as we're going to see. I mean, it's pretty clear already, but it's just going to get clearer and clearer how They didn't do anything that they should have done in this investigation. I mean, it's just chronically inept. It's just staggering. And this is illustrated succinctly by this comment where they're responding to Dr. Evans. I won't read the whole thing out because some of it is quite trivial. But they say, I totally understand and will make sure some clinical paperwork for some of the cases is available for you on Monday. Why? Why are you making the clinical paperwork available for him? What you should be doing is interviewing him and trying to establish his credentials and whether or not he's going to be an appropriate person. You have claimed, Dr. Paul Hughes, who led the investigation, he has claimed that some sort of thorough process took place to establish the best person for the job. Now, that was always extremely difficult to believe because you ended up with what is possibly the worst person for the job. But we know for a fact that was just complete bullshit. You didn't do anything. You just handed everything on a silver platter to Dr. Evans, basically because he didn't charge you any expenses. Well, he just asked for expenses. He didn't charge a fee to drive down there. And we know the probable reason why he didn't charge a fee. I won't speculate on that, but I'm sure people have already drawn their conclusions regarding that. So you didn't ever engage anyone else. You didn't ever speak to anyone else. You didn't ever consider anyone else. And you should not be offering up the clinical paperwork to someone you haven't even decided whether there's a crime, but you've already told him that there was a crime. He's already telling you, yeah, basically there's a crime here, just give me the paperwork. You then say, oh yeah, here's the paperwork. You're supposed to be establishing whether he's a suitable person for the investigation. That's what you're supposed to be doing. That's called due diligence. That is a bare minimum requirement. It should be even more heightened in this case because extraordinarily, you didn't contact him. He contacted you, effectively. So that should be a red flag immediately to anyone with, 2 brain cells. It's just unbelievable. Like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we'll get the clinical paperwork. I mean, I'm surprised you didn't put on a 3-course meal for him and get him some champagne. Like, what else could you have laid on for him? You're supposed to be there to find out whether or not he's credible. You're supposed to be there to find out whether or not he's appropriate. There's no way you should have been giving him clinical paperwork at this stage. So anyway, this lady Sonia Bayliss writes to Adam Bolger and then requests the clinical paperwork. Dr. Evans asked if he could have some clinical paperwork. So what you say is, no, of course you can't have clinical paperwork. We don't know if we're going to instruct you yet or not. We don't know if you're reliable. We don't know if you're suitable. We haven't met you yet. So we're not going to bend over backwards to give you clinical paperwork. Although we have told you there's an investigation. We have told you the nature of the investigation. We have told you what the paediatrician said. We have told you that we suspect a nurse. So we might as well just hand over the clinical paperwork at this point. And I don't want to be guilty of ranting here, but this is symptomatic of the complete lack of competence in virtually every institution in this country at this point in time. I'm not going to get bogged down in this and go beyond that, but it's just a complete lack of intelligence, complete lack of awareness, complete lack of understanding, complete lack of competence. And I've said previously, the worst thing is, it's not even that surprising. It's not even that surprising. So the meeting eventually takes place on the 10th of July and it's attended by Aaron Day, Sonia Bayliss and Dr. Dewi Evans. Also in attendance were Paul Hughes, Janet Moore, Adam Bolger and D.S. Johnson. I'm not sure what his Christian name is, doesn't really matter. Current situation brief provided to Dr. Evans and the rest of the team, then discussed 2 cases in detail. Finally, draft terms of reference was drawn up between the investigation team and Dr. Evans. I'm not going to correct the grammar this time, I corrected it earlier. Potential to instruct a forensic paediatric pathologist at a later stage with regards to some of the CODs. NCA colleagues signed a confidentiality agreement. Next stage to get all further cases to Dr. Evans electronically to his agreed location securely, i.e. 28 cases in total, including collapses for his review by the beginning of August. Envisage he needs 2 weeks to do all the cases and make notes, which in turn will be typed and provided the following 24 hours for proofreading. A follow-up meeting will be held at the beginning of September. So, what happened to finding the best expert? Exactly. So there's a couple of comments here from the author about discussing two cases in detail. This had not been the original plan and suggests a disorganised, non-systematic approach, which I think is absolutely correct. But I think even that is a generous assessment of this utter shambles. While Dr. Evans in his various post-trial podcast interviews says that one of the two babies was baby O, who was the other baby? A very valid question. Of course, we'll never know the answer to that question because Cheshire Police don't even complete their own Twitter feed anymore because they're too embarrassed to talk to anyone. Second point, potential to instruct a forensic paediatric pathologist at a later stage. What happened to the obstetrician and the infectious diseases expert, and why at a later stage? Why not straight away or even before Evans looks at the notes? So these are all very valid questions. I didn't go into that too much detail because we're going to hear more about this as we continue through this video and through this farcical effort from Cheshire Police. So then we have notes from Sonia Bayliss of this 10th of July meeting between Cheshire Police, National Crime Agency and Dr. Dewi Evans. And there's a few details about what they're discussing. Then there's a comment from the author here that baby K was not one of the 8 that paediatricians had concerns about. Why is it a priority? So you see here priorities baby I, baby O and P, babies A and B, baby K. Perhaps it is because of what Dr. Jairam told police about baby K, which may have helped convince them to launch an investigation. Indeed, David Davis MP has asked Cheshire Police to investigate Dr. Jairam for perjury in relation to what he told the police and said on the stand in relation to baby K. So we're going to learn more about child K as we continue through these documents. So I won't say any more about that at this point in time, but of course that is a valid observation. And then we found out that Dewi doesn't want to see other reports and doesn't want to hear from any other clinicians. And there was an interest. This is a remark here from Dr. Evans that is actually valid. He just completely abandons this later on. Thresholds, why the child died, anything surprising about why the child died, if unexpected is anything suspicious, if suspicious was the breach of duty, if suspicious that someone inflicted anything. And then he kind of asked the question of, are paediatricians covering their backs due to the high number of deaths? Now, of course, that is a very valid question. It's a question that many people have asked in the comment section of this channel. The problem is that he didn't do anything to investigate this whatsoever because he didn't look at the previous reports and he didn't look at anything related to the hospital, and he assumed that the hospital had done all the tests correctly. So when he's in court saying, oh, I thought the standard of care was excellent, and I thought this was excellent, I thought that was excellent, he hasn't got a clue because he never looked at any of those things, and we know that for a fact because it's in black and white in these documents. So then there's a few comments here about premature babies, stress, stop breathing and HR goes down, oxygen sat falls, then HR falls. If on life support machine essentially carry on breathing, they are intubated to keep airway open. If something gets into lung, will collapse lung. So I suppose my observation of this would be that this is a rather crude summary of the things that could go wrong to a neonate. We've heard these comments from Dr. Evans of, babies are relatively simple things, there's not much that can go wrong with them. And that seems to infect and pollute his thinking throughout the entire process. So given the fact that this is his kind of general mindset, given the fact that he doesn't look into anything from the hospital, given the fact that he doesn't want to speak to other experts, given the fact that he doesn't want to see anything from previous reports, he just gets into this incredibly narrow focus of baby shouldn't collapse for no reason. Oh, look, this baby's collapsed for no reason. That must be malfeasance. But as I keep saying, we'll see more of that as this video continues. So then Dr. Evans starts to discuss some of the specific cases along with some other issues. So the first thing I've highlighted is it's rare for doctors to be alone with babies, usually nurse present, nurse usually alone. So, they've prompted him saying that they suspect a nurse, and now he's coming to the conclusion that's required. And it obviously says here, nurse likely to cause more harm than doctor. Based on what? Again, this is just basically the prejudice of saying doctors can't do anything wrong. I'm a doctor. I'm a paediatrician. They're paediatricians. Paediatricians could never be wrong. Will I sign this letter in favour of Sir Roy Meadow? Of course I will. Blah, 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 blah. It's just a clear prejudice that we've already established and already discussed. then he says collapse is quick except with infection building up or brain bleed or if loose tube. So as he never investigated infection at any stage, it's very difficult for him to rule this out. But let's move on to the next point. This is an important one. So triplets surviving 24 hours should survive. So there's a study here, for example, that indicates that there were approximately 1.6% of babies in neonatal units between 2012 and 2022. And for some of that period, the outlook in neonatal units was better than it was, broadly speaking, in 2015 to 2016 when the indictment occurred. Of course, in addition to that, this was a terrible unit, as we know. So to say that a triplet should definitely survive if it survives 24 hours is just rather flippant. That's I think the most generous assessment you can make, because 1.6% of neonatal babies in this study died. And then, of course, for triplets, it's much worse. It's potentially 3 times the survival rate is only on 5%. There were differences in survival rates between singleton, twin, and triplet neonates: 95%, 95%, 97%. So a triplet is vulnerable by its very nature, and a neonate is vulnerable by its very nature. And you can't just say if it survives 24 hours that it will survive. Just a typically flippant remark from him. And then the next thing is this thing about the ruptured subcapsular hematoma. So the pathologist has cited the fact that it could be due to a traumatic birth or resuscitation. That's in the pathology. This is very, very early on, and Dr. Evans should have taken that into consideration. But of course, if he'd taken that into consideration, you couldn't include Child O in the court case because he's noted the ruptured subcapsular hematoma, but that almost completely disappears from the court case. The court case barely takes into consideration the ruptured subcapsular hematoma because Dr. Evans doesn't think it's of any significance. Dr. Evans instead focuses on this thing that he walked in 10 minutes or less than 10 minutes, or indeed before he even reached the police station, decided was suspicious. So he hand-waved away what the pathologist said about birth or resuscitation that has now been cited by the panel. So you can see from the time that jurors were told Dr. Evans had concluded in an earlier report that the cause for Child O's collapse was trauma to the liver. A hematoma bleeding had been found in the liver during a post-mortem examination, but Dr. Evans never comments on that. He never really makes any reference to this in court based on what we've seen. And then there's a comment here that Dr. Evans had known no case that chest compressions had resulted in a liver hematoma as seen in the case of Child O. But in actual fact, he'd cited a potentially traumatic birth. He just realised, I can't put that in the court case because it doesn't point to malfeasance. And actually, we know more about this birth now, and we know that there were problems with ventilation and other issues. And then there's comments here in relation to Child P, also related because a second twin. Small hematomas in the liver were potentially a result of CPR or as a result of prematurity, and there was not enough to say that it was an impact injury. And when we look at the panel opinion, it's noted there were unacceptable delays in recognition and treatment of the pneumothorax. Pneumothorax can occur in preterm infants with mild respiratory distress syndrome, especially with CPAP or other respiratory support, or even without any lung disease or respiratory support. So therefore, this infant died from a pneumothorax that was suboptimally managed. It's not really clear how Dr. Evans and Manarides managed to miss this. And then in response to Dr. Evans, in a later comment from the police, we see them referencing coroner's reports for those who died elsewhere and all coroner's reports. Now, I'm not sure if they ever actually acquired those reports, but what we can say is that they don't play any part in the hypotheses of Dr. Evans whatsoever, and they never appear in the court case. They're just not referenced. So I'm not sure what happened to that. Of course, the pathology reports and of course the coroner reports are important. It's just that they were completely discarded and disregarded. And there's also reference to hospital notes, again, Dr. Evans just simply didn't need these, so they just melted away and disappeared from the court case and indeed the investigation. There are also comments here about needing a consultant paediologist. I'm assuming they mean paediatrician who's currently practicing. Of course, they didn't bother finding a currently practicing paediatrician. They just allowed Dr. Evans to do everything, even though, as I said, they claimed they would look for the best person, and they were aware they might need someone who's currently practicing, but they never managed to actually find that person. Apparently, they also need a paediatric pathologist. It's doubtful they even found that, but even when they did have Manarides, he wasn't directly involved in Dr. Evans' theories. He just, he should have been there. They should have had a panel that were working together collectively and looking at all of the things systematically. In fact, Dr. Evans was able to do everything, and then Manarides, as he conceded in court, he didn't even see the notes. He just rubber stamped the opinion of Dr. Evans after Dr. Evans has already done his work. And as I've already mentioned to you as well, they arrested Lucy Letby when only Dr. Evans had seen the notes. So there's a comment here from the author that may need consultant paediologist currently practicing. It is instructive that Cheshire Police appear to be acknowledging here the limitations of Dr. Evans, given he had been out of clinical practice for nearly 10 years. So they acknowledged them, but they never did anything about it. They did literally nothing. They didn't even try to look for another paediatrician, let alone appoint one. And then Adam Bolger, I think he's from the National Crime Agency, writes to Sonia Bayliss. Hi Sonia, thanks for attending yesterday. We were certainly impressed with Dr. Evans, and he's clearly very interested in assisting us! ! So we've seen this comment previously. It's been referenced in The Guardian. It's just completely inappropriate, obviously. They just seem to have got very excited about the fact that they can do a big investigation. It's just deeply unprofessional. And the author here comments that it's very revealing. Not only is it an inappropriate comment, but Dr. Evans should not have been very interested in assisting. The latter smacks of bias that Cheshire Police should have been wary of rather than enthusiastic about. I mean, I couldn't agree more. Also, it is not clear whether Sonia ever supplied Adam with details of SIOs that Evans had previously supplied statements for. This is the only indication of any sort of vetting of Evans, but there is no evidence any was in fact done. So then we have Dr. Evans writing to Janet Moore on the 18th of July. I mention here, or highlight here, that he preferred not to receive the findings of any previous reviews or investigations, as he wanted to supposedly minimise the risk of groupthink contamination. I would have thought the reasons why he didn't want the findings of any previous reviews are quite obvious, and I would have thought it's quite obvious that that's not the real reason. And then there's some other copies about case files and post-mortem reports. So the author here has some comments on this regarding all post-mortem reports. Is this not why a paediatric pathologist should have been instructed at this point? And indeed, other experts should be there as well. They've had numerous opportunities to do this. They've had numerous opportunities to speak to other people other than Dr. Evans. They haven't even done the basic thing of going to the National Crime Agency. It's not difficult. One email, it takes about 2 minutes. Dear National Crime Agency, we're doing this investigation into the Council of Chester. Could you provide a list of potential paediatricians for our investigation? Not difficult, and they would come back with some. They didn't even bother doing that. The second point is, I think that reviewing the Chester records is sufficient for now. This refers only to baby's notes per previous messages and meeting minutes. Again, why did he not want to see documents related to the RCPCH report on hospital failings and issues? I think we know the answer to that question. Again, this is almost a rhetorical question, a very valid one, of course. We know damn well why he didn't want to investigate anything else. It's very obvious that he doesn't want to find anything that might be inconvenient. And then there are comments here from Dr. Evans. I understand there are 25 files for 28 babies who between them sustained 40 collapses. So I believe this is different from figures that we saw elsewhere. So I just wanted to highlight that briefly. The rest of this is not particularly interesting, just correspondence between Dr. Evans and the police. Sorry, I should emphasise this sentence as well. One needs to accept at all times that babies who are unwell and in need of neonatal intensive care facilities are frequently clinically unstable. So this seems to be very significant because throughout the court case, Dr. Evans claimed that every infant in the case was stable and not unwell, which obviously we know now is completely ridiculous and farcical. So then Dr. Evans goes on to say the following: with regard to the clinical issues, I propose to look at each ALTE, so he defined this earlier on, acute life-threatening event, by applying the following thresholds. Is there a clear explanation regarding the cause of the collapse? Common causes include infection, which I didn't bother looking for, intracranial bleed or blocked endotracheal tube. If there is an identifiable clinical cause, it's unlikely that one would be able to distinguish this clinical event from a potentially suspicious one. If not, is the cause of the collapse unexpected or unusual? If it is there any indication of unacceptable care, such as a delay in identifying subtle symptoms and signs? So we know this is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, and we know they failed, and Dr. Evans failed as well to identify subtle symptoms and signs. He basically just said, oh, probably everything's just injecting air. I'll say that for basically every single case. And then when there's another symptom that I can't account for with that, I'll just make something up and say, oh yeah, Lucy probably did this or Lucy probably did that. That's what he did. He didn't identify any subtle symptoms and signs. He didn't make any effort to do so. He didn't make any effort to look at any so-called unacceptable care. So the alleged breach of duty was never going to occur because he never looked for it in the first place. And then he says, is there any indication that a collapse occurred as a result of a deliberate act on the part of one or more member of staff? This, of course, means thinking the unthinkable, except that you were already thinking this before you even arrived at the police station. So for you, it's not particularly unthinkable. Everyone says that it's unthinkable. In fact, you're even quoting something that has been said elsewhere, because I believe the paediatrician said we didn't want to think the unthinkable. So has Dr. Evans actually seen these comments and then repeated them, because he's literally used exactly the same phrase? And everyone always claims, oh, we didn't want to think the unthinkable, but coincidentally, we immediately thought the unthinkable. So then he goes on to say, exploring potential criminal acts, the evidence or proof required to identify any such situation will need to be compelling to satisfy due process. Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? We've now seen the Crown Prosecution Service throw out very similar cases. So actually, if the police had done a competent job, if you'd done a competent job, if competent people had been called in, if the Crown Prosecution Service was competent, this never would have gone to court. Unfortunately, it did, and Lucy Letby is paying the penalty for that. Any ALTE that reaches this level of suspicion would need a careful review looking at matters such as opportunity, unusual but known clinical events, and FLA, fabricated or induced illness. So we're coming towards this stage, at the end of this stage of the investigation here. I'll go over the comments from the author here. If there is an identifiable clinical cause, it's unlikely that one will be able to distinguish this clinical event from a potentially suspicious one. So I didn't dwell on this too much because I knew there was this very valid author's comment here. There were many identifiable clinical causes, and pathologist McPartland said only 2 deaths were unexplained. So why was Evans so easily able to say that events were suspicious when he thinks that this is unlikely that one will be able to do? So again, there's just simply no valid answer to that question. There's no reason why the coroner's report should be overturned. There's no reason why pathology report should be overturned. There's no way that he should have looked through all these cases and never seen anything that would point to natural causes. As is rightly described here, there were numerous identifiable causes. There were the footprints of natural causes were all over these cases, and yet he managed to identify none of them. The second point is there any indication of unacceptable care, such as a delay in identifying subtle symptoms and signs? If there is, this takes us down the road of alleged breach of duty. So I've already commented on this, but the author rightly says there were many, many such indications. Why did Evans ignore them? So I'm not sure that he did ignore them. I would say that he deliberately didn't look for them. So obviously never going to identify them if you don't look for something. I suppose there's 3 possibilities. Either he ignored them, having seen them, he didn't look for them in the first place, he was too incompetent to find them, or a combination of the 3. The third comment is the evidence or proof required to identify any such situation will need to be compelling. The only evidence that came remotely close to being compelling was the 2 blood test results, and even that has been thoroughly debunked by new experts. Surely, if the evidence of intentional harm was compelling, it would have been picked up by the original pathologists, countess doctors, etc. Again, it's impossible to add anything to that. I mean, it's just really damning for Dr. Evans. But what I would say in addition to this point is that he's talking about the 2 blood test results in relation to child F and child L. Dr. Evans never gave any evidence, and they were never part of his reports. So the only compelling evidence was not provided by the person who was required to go into the police station and look at all the cases. It was provided by Dr. Brewery. Dr. Brewery is, we believe, certainly according to his own account, that was printed in Vanity Fair in an article called The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. According to that account, Dr. Brewery identified the Inchling cases, despite the fact he was the accuser of Lucy Letby, who is the primary reason why Cheshire Police are investigating in the first place. Then point 4, regarding Evans' mention of FLI, this, interestingly, is another term for Munchausen syndrome. This is a syndrome invoked in many previous wrongful convictions of caregivers by fanatical expert doctors. Perhaps this is why there was no mention of it again. So this is a great point. I didn't know that at all. I don't know much about Munchausen's. It's a very sad situation. I won't comment beyond that. You can all draw your own conclusions about why he's citing this. So then there's more comments here from Dr. Evans, and he says, I do not think it's necessary to consider additional expert opinion at this stage. We don't need expert opinion, we just need Dr. Evans. We don't even need a practicing paediatrician, which have been recognised by the police, we just need Dr. Evans. So he is hand-waving away everything we saw here. So forensic and neonatal pathologist, forensic toxicologist, clinical pharmacologist, nurse with experience of working in a special baby unit, medical expert involved in obstetrics, someone with neonatal births, obstetrician to review the medical histories, this thing about medical expert involved with the CDOP process, something to do with neonatal statistics. Of course, they could have brought in Professor Jane Hutton. All of this was just thrown away, and we just get Dodgy Dowie sat in there on his own, just going, oh yeah, this is... We're going to go through that process in the next video, because I'm going to pause this in a second. But truly, it is extraordinary. It would be... I actually gave the police a little bit more credit than they deserve, because I thought that Dr. Evans would have somehow convinced them not to do this, and they didn't know to do it. And so they made a mistake. I know a bit more about police investigations now because I've spoken to Dr. Steve Watts. I know how much protocol there is, and obviously we now also have the specific documents which indicated the National Crime Agency said, do this, contact these people, get in contact with these people, make sure you've got an up-to-date paediatrician. And they've done nothing that they were told to do, and nothing that they claimed that they've done in their so-called documentary. A documentary is required to document things, so it's not a documentary, obviously. But they could have done this. They could have got they could have had several paediatricians and maybe even a neonatologist. They could have had numerous experts. They could have had them all working simultaneously. They could have done what they were asked to do. They were aware they were supposed to be doing, which is a multidisciplinary review. It's not that they didn't know about this. It's not that it wasn't made clear that this is what they were required to do. They just didn't do it. They allowed Dr. Evans to say, don't bother doing that. Just let me do everything. We know why. He wanted to do everything. It's very obvious why he wanted to do everything. It's very obvious why he wouldn't want other experts involved. It's very obvious why he wouldn't want to look at the hospital and the climate of the hospital. It's very obvious why he wouldn't want to know about infection and see previous reports, etc., etc. We're going to see what he did in the next video, but this is just an incredible situation and just phenomenal incompetence from Cheshire Police. And indeed, the author has said, very much echoed my words, it is extraordinary that Dr. Evans is allowed by Cheshire Police to override the NID's recommendations to instruct a number of experts. Why does he not think it is necessary to consider additional experts at this stage? Clearly because he wants it to be his show and thinks other experts might disagree with the inflicted harm he is eager to invoke. Much better to get them on board later, simply to peer review his work rather than investigate alongside him, as indeed happened. So, absolutely agree with every word of that. The last thing I'll point out is it now looks very strongly as if Dr. Evans was involved in the appointment of the other experts as well. In summary, it is clear that from the very beginning of their investigation, Cheshire Police never examined the Countess of Chester contextually. The focus narrowed rapidly onto a single nurse, Lucy Letby, and never expanded beyond that. These leaked documents show a sequence of choices and omissions that, taken collectively, represent a highly skewed, biased, and incompetent inquiry. We also learn more about the modus operandi of Dr. Dewi Evans, and this is perhaps best symbolised by his 21st of May statement to the National Crime Agency that the police are better at investigating medical matters than the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. This is a statement without reason or justification for anyone from any background, let alone someone who had worked as a paediatrician. Once Dr. Evans had inserted himself into the picture, he rapidly became the linchpin of the operation. Instead of the police convening a multidisciplinary panel and selecting independent practicing clinicians, they engaged Evans, who had been out of clinical hospital practice for many years, and then allowed him to drive the process. Despite previous claims that they had carefully selected experts, it is clear that Cheshire Police never made even the most lazy attempt to engage with anyone else at all. Internal emails record that police discussed instructing Evans, passing him case summaries, and even floated the idea that he might assist with interviewing the nurse they had already identified as a potential nominal. In short, before any investigation of the unit or of any alternative explanations, police were already preparing to treat an individual as a suspect and to let Evans shape how the inquiry would be run. Those internal exchanges also show that Cheshire Police were repeatedly told they should conduct a multidisciplinary review. The National Crime Agency suggested bringing in forensic and neonatal pathologists jointly, a forensic toxicologist, clinical pharmacologist to review lab testing, experienced neonatal nursing input, obstetric expertise, infectious disease specialists, and people familiar with the child death overview process and neonatal statistics. But few, if any, of those experts were actually engaged, and this occurred on the advice of Evans. Similarly, prior reports such as the RCPCH review and local CDOP findings were explicitly excluded from Evans' work. Evans hand-waved any need to contextually understand the hospital or investigate any possibility of infection. The net effect was to allow a single, non-practicing, unregistered clinician to review notes in isolation rather than to set up the kind of simultaneous cross-checking panel the NCA and other experts would recommend. Perhaps the most striking detail is how much case material was handed to Evans very early on. Evans was given individual case notes, including those for Child O, at an early meeting, even before he had been formally instructed. Those papers included flagged concerns that one member of staff had been present at more of the incidents than others. In other words, the police had already been told a nurse was a common factor before Evans began his review, and they then passed this information to Evans. This clearly created a powerful cognitive anchor. It is increasingly clear that Cheshire Police never considered any other possibility than malfeasance by the nurse who had been identified by Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam on the 15th of May when the constabulary suddenly did a rapid about turn. Of course, it should also be mentioned that they would later involve Breary and Jairam in the investigation. Evans' own approach, as logged in his notes and emails, compounded that problem. He repeatedly insisted on starting from scratch and declined to receive previous review findings, a stated aim to avoid groupthink, which is highly disingenuous. Evans' refusal to examine past reports functioned effectively as a decision to exclude contextual, systemic, and clinical analyses that might point away from intentional harm. He also wrote that before looking for suspicious matters, one must first see whether the clinical trends followed recognised patterns, but appended language made it clear that he already suspected or had decided that they did not. The documents portray someone who declared neutrality while telling the police he expected to find suspicious collapses, and who discouraged bringing in experts who may have challenged that view. The police internal emails show a bewildering eagerness to accommodate Evans. They arranged a meeting, asked for his availability and costings, appeared relieved when he agreed to do an initial meeting for expenses only, and were then excited when he turned up. It is unclear why Cheshire Police did not more carefully vet candidates, or indeed speak to anyone else at all. It appears that Cheshire Police was swayed by the prospect of a big, high-profile inquiry rather than by a sober methodological approach. Other clinicians have since produced reviews that identified multiple clinical and systemic explanations for the deaths and collapses: increased acuity, staffing pressures, delayed recognition, suboptimal management of problems, natural causes, and other clinical factors. And these meshed with existing coronial process and pathology review. Yet Evans' reports and the later prosecution case entirely ignored these findings. Pathologists' and coroners' reports were barely integrated into his so-called work, and material clinical explanations that would point away from malice were either downplayed or discarded completely. There were many identifiable medical causes in the files, and yet Evans somehow missed all of them. The insulin-related test results, the 2 blood tests that later were found by Dr. Stephen Breary, were not examined early on by a forensic toxicologist or clinical pharmacologist, and the choice of who would give expert testimony at the trial seems to have been constrained by who the police were willing to advance a particular essay interpretation. Police seemingly made no effort to engage forensic toxicologists as they had been advised. Above all else, Dr. Dewi Evans was determined that no one else should contribute to the review or challenge his work, and he was then involved in the selection of experts that effectively did little more than rubber stamp it. The cumulative picture is that the NCA advised a multidisciplinary approach. Police notes and emails demonstrate repeatedly that the advice was known, and yet a decision path was taken that funneled everything through Dr. Evans, handed him case notes early on, discouraged the use of prior reviews, and failed to recruit or properly instruct the range of specialists that the situation evidently required. It was frankly a pig's ear of an investigation. Procedural failures plus cognitive bias produced a completely non-scientific review that was narrow, prejudiced, and institutionally biased, designed before it began to prove the only hypothesis that was ever examined. This was a calamitous investigation conducted by incompetent people. This has been evident since Cheshire Police released their universally lambasted film on the investigation itself, but now it is clearer than ever. In the second part of this series, we will examine what Dr. Evans wrote about the specific infants in the indictment. Thank you for watching.